someone who couldn't make it asked that we record. So
Okay. So, um, when Maeve asked me what I was going to talk about, um, I wasn't quite sure how to say what I was going to talk about, because what I want to talk about is practice, our practice, because we're all engaged in this enterprise. Um, but it's not so much that I want to give practice instruction as that I would like to set up some, process of investigation into our own practices, to look at our own practices and to think about what we're doing and what we're engaged in. Just some feedback for ourselves. So basically what I'm going to be doing is just raising a lot of questions and seeing where that takes us. And we're on the 30-30-30 format. So I will talk about stuff for about a half an hour, give or take. And then we've got um, some time for you guys to point out all the failings of my presentation. You've all got your own practice. um, Whatever our practice is, it's based on our understanding of what we're doing and what we think we're attaining. Sometimes in Dharma scenes, people sort of say, does it matter what you think? Whether you think all is one or all is empty? Does it matter what you think if you do the right practice? On the other hand, you could say, does it matter what you do if you've got the right perspective? Does it matter what you do? I think, our understanding is such that if we're acting out of delusional understanding, well, then the results of our practice won't be what we expect. Nothing, I'm not saying wrong or right. It's just that we'll be surprised. So I thought I would talk a little bit about some of the kinds of understandings that are floating around out there, and you guys can throw in some different ones if you, when we talk about it. First, a really simple understanding is that, practice leads to enlightenment. Whatever we think enlightenment is, it leads to the promised land. It leads to salvation. It leads to whatever it is we want. Practice takes us there. Sounds pretty obvious, but it's a particular kind of model about practice. The metaphor would be a path to enlightenment. And I think actually, in my own view, and let me just say this out front, I have my own practice and my own biases about this, which are certainly going to come through, so you'll have to correct for that. But one of these metaphors is practice leads to enlightenment. And enlightenment, in my vision, is a mirage. It's just a word. We have no idea what it really means. It's sort of hazy, unless someone has a clear definition of it that they'd like to offer. It usually just means what we're aiming for. Practice leads to it. It's like saying, the path to enlightenment. The path to the Grand Canyon is not the same as the Grand Canyon. And this is a particular kind of metaphor and sets up particular kinds of expectations. You could also say that the path, it's a path of enlightenment. If your path were a circumambulation of some holy site, the goal is to get on the path and stay on the path. You're not really going anywhere except around in circles. But the path itself becomes the goal. Practice becomes enlightenment. Dogen, who was sort of the founder of Zen practice in Japan, for him, practice was enlightenment. And so they pretty much didn't rely on scriptural texts, some stories. But practice is enlightenment. And my understanding of that is, there's a sutta where the Buddha describes 3 types of minds. I can't remember the name of it, but I could dredge up the reference if you needed it. But 3 types of minds. There's the mind that's like a running sore. There's a mind that's like a flash of lightning, and there's a mind like diamond. Now, the mind that's like a running sore, the metaphor here is that we're leaking greed, hatred, and delusion out into the world in all of our behaviors. And that's the running sore. Interesting, the word asava, in the Buddha's meaning is effluent, sewage, it's leakage. And the word nirodha, which is the 3rd truth, actually, technically in Pali, it's used to refer to the process of shoring up leaks, in a rice paddy or something. So the idea is to stop the leaking. So that you've got the mind like the running sore, you've got a mind like a flash of lightning. And the metaphor here is that you're out at night in a raging storm, you can't see anything, it's pitch black, and then the lightning flashes, and all of a sudden, for a second, you see all the clouds, the whole landscape, and then it's gone. And then the idea is that you can't see it again, but you remember it. And the metaphor here is like the metaphor of insight. When you have an insight into the nature of dukkha, into the nature of suffering, then your practice will be to eliminate suffering as it comes up in your life, as you understand it from that flash of insight. Jack Kornfield had a book some years ago called After the Ecstasy, The Laundry. And the idea is that after the flash of insight, there's work to be done. So is our practice a path to something? I mean, only you know what you're practicing. Are you practicing to attain something, or is your practice itself fulfilling? Now, for Dogen, I think the idea is the practice is not just restricted to the cushion. The practice would be your entire life. You could have an understanding that all is one. There's a oneness of all things. The universe is one, and our goal, our practice, is to become one with everything, to overcome Maya, the delusion. This is the Brahmin vision of things, to overcome Maya and the delusion of this world, and to realize the true thinker behind the thoughts, the seer behind the seen. Remember the Buddha's sutta where he was instructing Bahiya in the seeing only the seen, in the hearing only the heard, in the touching, tasting, smelling, and the cognizing only what's cognized. He was directly addressing this notion about, in the seeing, the seer behind the seen, the thinker behind the thoughts, the being behind us. So if that's your understanding, then your practice is going to be trying to see through Maya. You'll probably be involved in some sort of jhana absorptions, efforts to try to bring your attention to some particular exotic meditative state. A real obvious belief, if you thought everything's run by God, then the idea is to figure out what he wants and get with the program. So, but that would be a different set of practices. If your understanding is that the ultimate truth is that all relative understanding is empty, all relative truth is empty, well, then your attention would be drawn directly to your immediate experience. into the pleasantness and unpleasantness of it, the dukkha of it. And the effort might be to um, eliminate suffering. There are a lot of different things that we could want from practice. So we could approach our practice from the standpoint not just of what is our understanding and how does it lead us to, what does it lead us to do, but we could say, what are we looking for from practice? Some people come to practice initially, and these things change. Whatever your understanding is now, I'll bet it isn't the same as it was 5 years ago, because all these things change. So I'm just offering some ideas to measure, to give yourself a sense of where you are and what you're thinking. Some people come just for stress relief. You know, a lot of the mindfulness, most of the mindfulness training that happens nowadays happens in medical contexts, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based pain relief. I've seen a figure of 70% of mindfulness instruction takes place in these kinds of environments. So you could be coming for stress relief. You could have the notion that what you want to do is turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream, not being snagged by anything. This is a particular kind of meditative state. Making thoughts go away, perhaps. And you can spend a lot of time, working with absorption states, jhana states, concentration states, in efforts to try to keep the mind steady and focused. And now you could be practicing concentration practice also the way Lee Brasington teaches it, Aikema, as a supercharged technique for mindfulness. Bring the mind really still and then open it for mindfulness practice. You could think your goal is to be enlightened, whatever that means. And if you don't really know what it means, then what you're going to do probably is follow the rules that you're given. You could think that your job, what you want is to put an end to suffering, to understand dukkha and put an end to dukkha. What is your practice going to look like then? For me, I think of complaint as a marker for dukkha, because it's an explicit expression of aversion to whatever it is you're complaining about. Whether the complaint is justified or not, it's a marker for dukkha. If you're complaining, you're suffering. You can respond to unpleasant experience with compassion instead of with aversion, which would be, but you could spend your practice could be focused on studying complaint, studying how that works. Whatever kind of practice you do will have results downstream, different outcomes that'll happen in accordance with your practice. I remember, just on the broadest level, if you're practicing the cello, you're not going to get better at shooting basketball. What you do will have consequences. You'll get better at what you're doing. I remember seeing Sister Sushila and Sister Dipankara at a meeting at Spirit Rock, and there were about 7 or 8 people in the front of the group, and the two of them were sitting and the Spirit Rock, amidst these Spirit Rock teachers, and they were so quiet, they were so still. Their practice for years had been cultivation of intense jhana states. They were disciples of Pao Ok, and very serious, and they were very still. And the Spirit Rock people looked like fluttering around. They were not uneasy people, but they were There was movement. So, if you spend your lifetime cultivating mental stillness, you can be still. You know? Whatever your understanding is, it will play out in your practice, and it will play out in the outcomes of your practice and what you attain. Or even if you think you're supposed to attain anything, that's part of the path is practice, or the path, the practice is the path, or the practice leads you to the goal. What do you actually do? What kinds of practices do we actually do? There's some common ones, and practices become habits, and habits become, the Buddha says what the mind routinely practices and cultivates becomes its inclination. So what kind of things do we do? We practice mindfulness. This is a very common practice, what we're pretty much all involved in. We're cultivating insight. Jack Cornfield says insight isn't something you can force. You can't make it happen. It's an accident, and our job is to become accident prone. But the way we practice mindfulness will can have different effects. Just do a short little experiment for a moment. We'll spend a minute doing mindfulness of sound. So what I'd like you to do is to just for a minute, let the sound that's coming in be the object of your mindful attention. In the same way you pay attention to the breath, use the sound this way. So you listen, if your mind drifts, bring it back to the sound, and just notice the sound. You may be in a very quiet environment. Notice what that quiet is like. What is the physical experience of it? What's the feeling of it? So spend a minute and just notice, be mindful of sound, and notice how it feels to be mindful of sound. And now let's spend a minute being mindful of the breathing and working to keep our attention on the sensations of the breath and noticing how that feels. You feel the difference between the two? If you cultivate one for 20 years, you're likely to feel a little different. One last thing that I used to do in the prison, which I don't get to do anymore. Let me just suggest this for a little fun for a moment. What I would suggest to these guys was to do both at the same time, to try to keep a balance, listen to the sound, balance between the breath, keep the mind equally paying attention, the balance between the sound and the breath the same. If you find yourself drifting towards the sound, bring your attention a little more to the breath. If you find yourself to the breath. So let's just do a minute of trying to maintain that balance and seeing how that works out. Now that last is more of a concentration practice than a mindfulness practice. You're being encouraged to keep your attention pretty strictly in check. They all feel different. You feel the difference of each one of those. So you know, what are you cultivating down the line? It's it's something to pay attention to. You could be cultivating concentration. You could be cultivating metta. You could be focusing on the feeling tone, the feeling tone of the body and the heart. You can do metta as a concentration practice when you repeat phrases over and over again, which is the way Buddhaghosa taught in the Visuddhimagga. Or you can do metta as a mindfulness practice, where you make an effort to recall, to evoke affection for someone or something. And as Sharon Salzberg said, metta is so powerful, it will bring up all the things that stand in its way. So if you try to evoke compassion, friendliness to some of the difficult people in your life, you can look at what comes up as fodder for mindfulness practice. You could your practice could be social activism. You have Bernie Glassman, who was a Zen teacher whose life was pretty much like the 10th of the ox herding pictures, the returning to the marketplace with open hands. He did street dharma and street chaplaincy. Sangha building is a form of this. We spend a lot of effort in creating communities to study the Dharma. It's not a necessary thing. The existence of Pachaka Buddhas, fully enlightened beings living alone, is a traditional notion. So Sangha building could be a way of, your practice could be scholarly, studying the early texts, focusing your attention on where they direct your attention to. You'll cultivate something different. And then there's a question about meditating at all. It was an early issue. It's hung around. Is meditation necessary? Is it desirable? Is it part of a path to something? Is it a path of something? how does meditation function? You know, for it's practice mindfulness. Because the real mindfulness for me is in my day to day, my walking around. Can I maintain awareness of the thoughts that arise as I engage my environment and other people, and not just act them out? You know, is meditation essential? I have a kind of a model that I have of how this practice works. So there's gradual cultivation of conditions followed by insight, a flash of lightning. And that changes our understanding, it changes our perspective. And then after the ecstasy, the laundry, there's work to do, because if we all of a sudden have this insight of that results in a compassionate response to someone who we had felt antipathy for previously, then we got to clean up that act. I think, don't the 12-step people have one of the steps going back and cleaning up your mess? You know, so there's this sudden enlightenment, then there's the realignment, a rechange of your understanding, a reframe of your understanding, which then affects your practice. So you may be practicing mindfulness for quite some time, and then you encounter some very charismatic Tibetan person, and you wind up doing Dzogchen for a while, because all of a sudden you've been, you know, your frame of reference, your understanding has changed through some insight into something. So our practice changes over time. You know, in terms of the Eightfold Path, right mindfulness, right concentration lead to insight and reframing of samadhi, our understanding of right understanding, which, you know, our intentions are rooted in our understanding, and our speech, action, and livelihood are rooted in our intentions. So that's the same sort of feedback loop. Practice, insight, change, reformatting everything. New insight, new change, cultivation. What do we get from our practice? You know, if we're Sangha building, we get a Sangha. If we're working on solitary concentration practice, we get maybe more of a hermit life, a monastic life, sedate life. We could wind up with a lot of frustration if we were expecting to be free from pain. Enlightenment, to me, the bliss of enlightenment means no more pain, no more unhappiness, no more unsatisfactoriness. Then you're going to find frustration. And after a while, you might say, well, I got to do something else. I got to do something besides this mindfulness stuff. Maybe I got to start with hallucinogenics. Maybe I've got to add something to the practice. You know, practice shopping. Well, maybe I should be doing more concentration, or maybe I should need a Tibetan master, or maybe the Zen people. You could get an easier life, you know, one where you trip over your own feet less, because a little more mindful awareness. There's a thing out there, a saying that, you know, I've heard before, some of you probably have heard too, the notion, what are you practicing for? Are you practicing for nibbana or for some spruced up samsara? Just being more comfortable in this delusion of samsara. And I think, you know, in light of the Mahayana notion that nibbana is samsara, then spruced up samsara would be spruced up nibbana. So the question then is, all of these things, just to address ourselves to our own practice, what we think we're doing, what we think we're going to get, what we think we're accomplishing. Are we accomplishing anything? Is there anything to accomplish? How different is it from the way it was? And the fact that our practice is certainly going to change. How tightly do we want to cling to the form of our practice now? How much flexibility? So I can rattle on for a bit, but I think the deal is we have some time for questions and conversation, because each of us has a practice. Each of us probably has a unique understanding of what we're doing. And they're all bringing us along with them. So what do you think? Is this of any use or help at all?